Welcome, my dear viewers. I'm Olga Demchuk, a researcher of the inner world of personality. Today, I would like to talk with you about relying on oneself. Right now, I am sitting on a chair. It is stable, it does not wobble beneath me. That means I can lean on it. It is whole. That is, it could be stable, but if I sat on it, it might simply fall apart. And it is also important that this chair maintains its stability because I could sit on it and for a while it would remain steady beneath me, allowing me to feel safe and calm. But it can be like in various shows when the floor opens up and the person falls down together with the chair. So you see, I need stability, wholeness, and steadiness. The same applies to our psyche. When we talk about relying on ourselves, we are also talking about stability, wholeness, and steadiness, because the psyche can be stable and whole, but not steady. When there are major mood swings, a person gets the impression that the world around them is changing. A person who is not used to owning their own emotions will project this instability onto the outside world. It will seem to them that the world is attacking them, even though the world moves and flows entirely according to its own laws. When we use proverbs, we often don't think about what they actually mean. For example, the phrase, the ground has slipped from under my feet, or the common expression, the ground has been pulled out from under me. When we say this, we have already projected outward and have not acknowledged our own change in state. We say, it's like the ground was pulled out from under me. And that's exactly how emotional instability can feel. But in reality, the ground is exactly where it was. What has changed is the emotional state. There's another expression we often use in Russian, to lose it, or more literally, to step outside of oneself. It means I was inside myself and then I stepped out. Or the ground slips away, a loss of emotional balance. At first glance, they seem to refer to different situations. However, in reality, both are about losing contact with one's true self. What has to happen to a person for them to lose contact with themselves for some reason? When I am grounded in my true self, I recognize, for example, that I am angry right now, and I tell myself, I am angry. In that moment, I remain anchored in myself. But if I say, you make me angry, at that moment, I am no longer relying on myself because I have attributed my own emotions to someone else. This is called projection. When I do not take ownership of my own aspects, but instead delegate them, I begin to lose my grounding because I have transferred my inner experience onto another person and made them the cause of it. And at that point, my position becomes more unstable. Today, I have prepared some supplementary materials for us so that you can better grasp the concept of relying on yourself. Look, I have 2 blocks here on wooden and 1 plastic. When we tilt the surface, the plastic block, as you can see, slides more quickly. It lacks weight and density. In the same way, a person who lacks density, that is, a realistic understanding of themselves, and therefore of reality, will lose their composure more quickly. It's as if they are hollow inside. What does it mean to have a realistic understanding of oneself? I read your comments and I see how you tend to idealize the real self, making it seem so wonderful, so remarkable, so perfect. That is not the case. The real self is when I am angry and I say I am angry. I do not try to blame someone else and say he's making me angry. This is what the real self is about. Or, for example, when I feel envy, I recognize that I am envious. This is an acknowledgement about oneself, a realistic understanding of oneself, and the ability to take responsibility for one's emotions first and foremost. In order for a personality to become solid, it must know itself precisely. Because a personality that does not know itself, that does not claim its own emotions, becomes like this hollow cube, unstable and more susceptible to the influence of the external world. Recently, I was having a conversation with a young woman, and as we spoke, I got the distinct impression that her personal boundaries were made of some kind of material that bends and gives way whenever you press on it, rather than holding firm. In other words, it's as if you can't lean on her like a knife going through butter. She changes her point of view, she doesn't defend her position, and she seems ready to instantly change some of her beliefs right on the spot. So this flexibility and softness actually come from the fact that the person doesn't yet have a logically complex worldview. The opposite can also happen when someone is excessively rigid, like a metal cube that won't move no matter how you tilt the surface. That too is an extreme, and usually these metal cubes only appear strong from the outside. But under stress, such people can fall apart, sometimes even to the point of developing psychiatric diagnosis. When we talk about projections, a person becomes like a sphere. In this case, the fall becomes uncontrollable. That is why I place so much emphasis on owning one's emotions. As soon as you step beyond your own boundaries and involve another person to explain your internal experiences, such as anger, envy, or dissatisfaction at that moment, you become an uncontrollable sphere. In other words, you have lost your stability. We have discussed integrity, stability, and steadiness. It is precisely this integrity that provides us with stability. Integrity means refusing the urge to blame others for your own problems, your own misfortunes, and most importantly, your emotions. When I say the ground has disappeared from under my feet, I have already made a projection. I have blamed the ground for my loss of stability. And we do this constantly. Especially when we ourselves become unbearable to ourselves. In this state, when we feel emotionally and mentally unstable, it becomes very crucial for us to take a certain dominant position for our own sense of security and control. You have probably noticed more than once that when you see someone who is better than you immediately want to find some flaws in them. As people sometimes say, there's nothing to criticize because our subjectivity always wants to dominate. This desire to dominate is the wish to be on top. That is, when there is a second person, we want to bring them down a notch and elevate ourselves. And you can bring absolutely anyone down. That is, it is possible, well, in extreme cases, to stipulate. Even if you can't find any real flaws, you can make them up, you can imagine anything you want about this person. And when we slander or look for flaws, we lower the other person and place ourselves above them. This is also a moment of losing stability. That is, any distortion of the truth sometimes we want to exaggerate, embellish, make our own strengths seem greater and our weaknesses smaller, while magnifying the flaws of others. This too is a rejection of the real self. It is also a refusal to rely on oneself, because weaving this desired image makes the personality unstable, especially if you have already lied to someone about yourself. It feels as though you constantly have to maintain that image. You become a prisoner of that image. And the more invented a person's idea of themselves is, the less they will be able to rely on themselves. When we pretend to be someone else, we constantly experience imposter syndrome. And for people who are completely unfamiliar with their real self, imposter syndrome will be a constant presence. In other words, there will always be a sense that I am about to be exposed because I am pretending to be someone I am not. I even reject who I truly am myself. That is, When a person understands who they really are, they can work on themselves. But when I reject who I truly am, at that moment I become very unstable, emotionally shaky, and ungrounded. When a person has a realistic view of themselves, this foundation is stable for them. This is that solid, steady ground beneath your feet, quite literally. But as soon as emotions begin to arise in our lives, we start to get a little bit shaken. Some people deliberately lose their footing. They remove the ground from under their feet, for example, through alcohol or drugs. It's actually very easy to take away this support from under your feet. Even listening to music can take away this support from under your feet. That is, when we listen to ourselves, we are no longer inside ourselves. It's as if we are in another world. Sometimes we have a need to step outside ourselves in order to take a break from ourselves. It is precisely at such moments that we watch TV series and we scroll through our feeds. I think you've all noticed that when there is some unbearable emotional tension, at that moment you want to break contact with reality. We even often say things like, "Don't tell me this, don't say it, I don't want to know about it." This means that I can no longer bear it. In the same way, it is possible to be unable to bear yourself. And then we need someone, for example, interaction with another person. And when I listen, when the other person is speaking, at that moment, it's as if I am no longer with myself. I am, in a way, living in that person's life. In the same way, we follow the lives of certain celebrities in order to live there, rather than within ourselves. I'm not saying that this is bad, but it's also necessary to take a break from yourself. I am not saying that this is wrong, not at all. I am simply drawing your attention to the fact that this escape happens for a reason. In psychiatry, there are two terms: depersonalization and derealization. Depersonalization is when a person becomes estranged from their real self. To some extent, all of us are a little depersonalized. That is, all of us have an idea of ourselves that does not fully match who we are in reality. First of all, we lack the capacity to truly understand our inner world. Secondly, some people do not look inward at all. They live within an imagined self image. But what is the downside of this imagined image? It is constantly being challenged by reality, as if reality is always saying, "No, you are not really like that." If you have the feeling that reality is attacking your self image, or even that reality is attacking you in general, this indicates that your idea of yourself is too idealistic. In other words, for some reason, we have not been able to acknowledge our own vulnerabilities and limitations. And then the ground beneath us begins to shake. But in reality, it is our idealistic self image that is being shaken. Deep down, we all know the truth about ourselves. Intuitively, each of us knows this truth, but we cannot accept it because there is an internal control that attacks us with self aggression for acknowledging this truth. In other words, we are essentially unable to reach ourselves because we have created a certain image, and any discrepancy with this image is punished by self aggression. That is why we cannot gain solid ground beneath our feet. I think that those who have been on this channel for a long time have felt this support. What it means to rely on the truth, what it means not to be afraid to admit something to yourself. This does not mean, to acknowledge evil within yourself. It does not mean to become evil. It existed before you acknowledged it, but now it is legitimized. And then it becomes a manageable, controllable part of your personality. Before we claim it as our own, it is like a cloud. We are constantly projecting it. And this sense of inner support is lost. People who lack this inner support are, for example, susceptible to propaganda. That is, they are swept up by emotions and drawn into the narrative that propaganda imposes. People who lack inner support may, for instance, idealize a tyrant. For example, a tyrant at work or a tyrant who governs a country. And instead of understanding that this is dangerous, that this person should be feared, a person, on the contrary, seems to feel love for them, as if to somehow explain it all to themselves. Or when a person finds themselves in some kind of mass psychosis, for example, in a group, they start to go along with the group without understanding what is actually happening. In other words, as people say, they are not thinking for themselves. This very act of not thinking for oneself is precisely the inability to rely on oneself. Because this love for the tyrant actually stems from the inner tyrant that a person also possesses. And this inner tyrant develops specifically in response to psychosis. That is, when our emotions begin to run wild, we can only restrain them through control. And so, in the same way, we look for this controlling authority or leader, a ruler, or someone else in order to hand over to them the responsibility for restraining our own psychosis. In other words, we make them an artificial external prop, not even a true support. It is more like a framework that holds me up, and I am afraid of it. And that is why I behave properly, not because I think for myself, but because I rely on ideas and principles of control. In general, ladies and gentlemen, this is an interesting and vast topic. I believe I have set your thought process in motion. That is the most important thing. This is my main goal on this channel, so that you learn to think for yourself, because you can study endlessly, you can spend hours listening to videos about certain people, about others, and keep going forever. And in that moment, no transformation happens within a person. They are not seeing with their own eyes, not listening with their own ears about themselves. This act of listening to information about someone else does not change a person from within. A person gains inner support only when an internal transformation takes place. And this internal transformation, this understanding of oneself, builds internal connections. Our structure becomes stronger, more realistic. So, if you are watching my videos about a friend of a friend, or about someone from your family, or about your spouse, or your children, or women from work, well, there is no point. You are simply wasting your time. Watch them with yourself in mind. Only then will it be useful. Then support will appear. Learn to think about and analyze yourself specifically. If it feels like the ground is slipping from under your feet, the first thing you need to do is realize that you are currently unable to withstand reality. And look for the reason why you cannot withstand reality right now, what it is that you cannot endure, cannot know, cannot accept. And the answers will be found. I'll wrap things up here. Feel free to subscribe to the channel about discovering your inner world. Here we're learning how to grow up emotionally, become self-reliant, and live more consciously. See you soon.